Hi everyone, welcome to Jawaras. Let's continue building authorization server. In the previous video, we have seen how to generate authorization code. Now, in this video, we will see what is the access token and what information it contains and how authorization server generates the access token. We will not go into coding in this video. In this video, we will just look at some informations about access token. There are many methods to get the access token and each of those methods are called grant type. Now, the goal of client application is to get hold of access token. There can be many ways. The first is authorization code grant. In this code grant, first of all, after logging in of the user, the authorization server issues an authorization code to the client application, and using that authorization code, the client application can get the access token. The another grant type is implicit grant, in which the authorization server will send the access token to the client application instead of authorization code. Another is password grant, where client application collects users username and password and uses those username and password in order to get access token from the authorization server. In the client credentials grant, the client application sends its own client ID and client secret to the authorization server in order to get the access token. And that access token is for that client application. It is not related to any specific user. The another grant type is refresh token grant. This grant is used to refresh the existing access token. So if some access token has expired and we have refresh token which can be used to refresh that access token. So we can send that refresh token to the authorization server and authorization server will send back the corresponding new access token. We will only work with authorization code grant flow. The implicit grant flow and password grant flow, it is advised to not use these two. So you should always use authorization code grant and refresh token code grant for your users, and for your machine you also should always use client credentials grant. Now let's see what is the flow of authorization code grant. So first of all, client app sends the authorization code to the authorization server, and then authorization server sends back the access token for that user. Now we have already seen how to get the authorization code, so that's why I have only included the part after getting the authorization code. We need to send some request to authorization server from the client app. First of all, the request method is post, and we send the request to token endpoint. And where do we get token endpoint from? So you can get this from the documentation of authorization server. Now we need to include the grant type, and its value will be authorization code. Then we need to include the authorization code itself, and the name of the parameter will be code and its value will be actual authorization code. The third parameter is redirect URI. So this should be the same redirect URI which we used to fetch the authorization code. Then we need to include client ID. So this will be the client ID. And if the client is confidential client, then we need to include the client secret as well. Now, authorization server may provide you some other way to pass the client ID and client secret. So for example, if the client is a confidential client, then you can pass client ID and client secret in authorization header as well. So in the authorization header, you can send the HTTP basic username and password. So username will be client ID and password will be client secret. It totally depends on your authorization server, how it accepts. Some authorization servers expect these to be included in request parameters. Some authorization servers expect these to be included in the authorization header, and some authorization servers can handle both situations. The authorization server needs to validate the authorization code or this whole request. So now what happens if this request is invalid? So there can be many types of failures. We will discuss that later. What are those failures? But what happens if there is any failure? In that case, we return one response where the first parameter is error, and this is some error code like invalid request. Then we include some error description and some error URI. So error URI is usually linked to authorization server's documentation, and there are some predefined error codes which you should use. The first is invalid request. So this is used when the request is invalid. So for example, you have missed some parameter. So in that case, the response status should be 400, that is bad request. And error description can be uh, like client ID is missing, or redirect URI is missing, or something like that. So it depends on which parameter is missing. The other error code is invalid client. Whenever you use this error code, then the response status should be unauthorized 401. And its description can be anything. For example, client is not valid. Now, when do we send this error code? So when client ID is not valid, or when client is confidential but client secret is missing from the request, or client is confidential, its client secret is in the request, but that client secret is not valid. Another error code is unsupported grant type, and with this code, the response status should be 400 bad request. And this is used when grant type is not one of the allowed grant types. The another is invalid grant. So in this error code, the response status should be 400, and the error description depends on validation failure. This can be thrown when authorization code is invalid, or authorization code has different client ID from the client ID which is getting in the request. If the authorization code is expired, the authorization code has different redirect URI from the one given in the request, and if authorization code is already used, that means if that authorization code is already used to get an access token. So in that, if you see some request like this, so in this case, you should immediately revoke the existing access token if you could. Now this is the successful access token response. So let's say our authorization code and this token request, everything is valid, and we need to issue a new access token to the user. So in that case, the content types would be application JSON, because we will return one JSON object to the client application. Cache control should be no store. So this is very important. We need to tell the client application that you should not, or you must not store this response. Now this contains few fields. The first is access token. So this is the access token which the client application can send to the resource server in order to access resources of the user, or resources of itself as well, if the request is on behalf of the client application. Then the token type, its value should always be error. Expires in, so this is the value in seconds after which the access token will expire, and after which the client application needs to renew the access token using the refresh token. So we include the refresh token as well. Then we may include refresh token expires in. So this is the number of seconds after which the refresh token will be expired. In that case, the client application needs to reinitiate the auth to flow. Now, some authorization server allow the refresh token to not expire. So in that case, we will not see the last parameter. Now, how to generate access token? So here you see we have access token. So we need to generate it. So how to generate that? There are two options. The first is store all this information in the database. So here if you see, the access token is a string only, but this string contains many information. So the first approach is we can store all these information in a database, and we can generate some random ID, and we can return that random ID to the client application. So if we want to store it in the database, it is very easy to implement. We don't need to do any encoding, decoding, encryption, and signature, anything. And it is very easy to revoke as well. So whenever we need to revoke the access to given to any access token, then we can simply delete that row from the database, or we can mark that row as deleted. The second approach is self-encoded token. All the information is inside this string. So there is a way to decode this string, and then the client application or the resource server is able to get all the information which is in the access token. So we don't need to store that in the database. The access token can be verified without any database lookup, because all the information is inside that token. So let's see what happens when we store the access token in database. So in that case, you can assume that we have a table where we are storing access tokens. The first column is access token, which can be a random string. Then subject. So subject means the username or user ID of the user. So let's say user one. Then is scopes. So here we can include space separated scopes which are given in to this access token. Then expires date. So when this access token expires, issuer, who issues the access token, generally the authorization server. Audience, so generally this is the URL of the resource server, but it is optional. Then we have client ID. So this is the ID of the client application which sent the request to generate the access token, and issue date. So when the access token was issued. So we can store information of all access token in the table. And now in this case, the access token is this randomly generated string or the ID of the row. Now how the resource server validate the access token. So what happens is when we generate the access token, we send this access token back to the client application. Now, whenever the client application needs to access some of users resources, then it sends some request to resource server with this access token. Now the resource server needs to verify or validate whether this access token is correct or not, or whether this access token has all the permissions or not. In that case, the resource server sends this access token to the authorization server. Then authorization server does some database lookup to get all the information from the table, and it sends that information back to the resource server whether the access token is valid or not. If it is valid, then what are all the permissions granted to this access token. So this is very simple. If we need to revoke any access given to access token, we can simply delete that row from the table, and then the access token will not be validated. But you can see here that if whenever resource server needs to validate the access token, it needs to send request to authorization server, and then authorization server will do a database lookup. So here we need some additional time, one for network call and another for database call. But sometimes the resource server and authorization server are the same things. Even in that case, we need this database lookup. Now let's see self-encoded access tokens. That means we don't want to store access tokens in any database. We want to encode all the information in the access token itself. There are many ways to encode access token. There is no predefined way, but the mostly used is JSON Web Signature spec. So what this is JSON serialized representation of the data, and we call it JSON Web Token. So this is how we generate JWT access token. So this image is taken from this auth0.com website. So you can refer here. This is a great book if you want to learn more about JWT. What we need to do is we need to put all the information in a JSON string, and then we need to base64 encode that information. So here you can see we have two fields, subject and role, and we are base64 encoding it. After encoding it, we need to sign this with the private key. There are many algorithms by which we can sign the data. So that algorithm we need to specify in header. So here you can see we are specifying algorithm HS256. That means we are using SHA256 with RSA algorithm to sign the data. So what we do is we create this header and we create this data. We base64 encode both of these things and we append them using dot. So we have some shared secret key, or we may have private key and public key pair. So we use that private key and some signing algorithm. So the signing algorithm should be same which we specified in the header. Using that, we sign the data. We encode this signature in base64 representation, and we add that signature also at the end of the data separated by a dot. So this is our access token. We send this access token back to the client application. Client application sends this access token to the resource server. Now resource server needs to validate whether this access token is valid or not. If it is valid, what are all the permissions it has. How do we validate it? The resource server should not do any network call to the authorization server. So resource server gets the public key from authorization server. So this is one time work. After getting public key, it verifies the access token. So there is no need to send request to authorization server, or we don't need to do any database lookup as well. But one problem is that the access tokens cannot be revoked. because there is no way for the authorization server to tell resource server that this access token is expired or not. Now, access token lifetime. So there is no hard rule that what should be the lifetime of access token. It totally depends on your application. So the generally we used short lived access token. So for example, access token will be expired after 1 or 2 hours. So that even if someone steals access token, they should not be able to make much damage to our system. And refresh tokens are long lived, so that we don't initiate the auth flow again and again and require the user to log in after a short period of time. So thank you everyone. That is all for this video. In the next video, we will implement this access token. So we will accept the token request from the client application. We will generate access token. We will encode it. We will sign it, and we will write some code to verify it as well in the authorization server, which may or may not be used to verify the token, by the way, because verification is done at the resource server. But as I have mentioned several times, that authorization server and resource servers can be same as well. With that, I will meet you in the next video. Until then, keep learning. Bye.